I think it's fair to say that Ron Graybill and Ron Numbers are the ones who led out in a very powerful way in the academic study of Ellen White. And in many ways, they're quite similar, and in many ways, they're quite different. Ron worked within the church, Ron Graybill did, and Ron Numbers worked outside the church, and sort of like a Venn diagram, the two of their lives. So it's been fascinating to learn from both of them and to enjoy both of them. This title for today is My Life with Ellen White, and I ask all of you to think about when you personally first heard about Ellen White. Scroll in your memories as far back as you can, and then see if you can identify the first time. The first time I heard about her was when my dad wanted to move from Honolulu out to the windward side of the island in Kailua. And so he read to us from her book called Country Living. And he persuaded us that Sister White wanted us to move from the city to the suburbs. So that actually, when I look at the apartment we were living in, the much more spacious house and property we had in Kailua, I can understand why he believed the messenger of the Lord was leading us in that direction. So think back onto where you first heard about her. This is Ephesians chapter 4, New Revised Standard Version. Therefore, the prisoner in the Lord, beg you to lead a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. That's as good a definition of panentheism as one can find. Not pantheism, P-A-N-E-N-T-H-E-I-S-M. One God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. But each of us was given grace according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it is said, when he ascended on high, he made captivity itself captive. He gave gifts to people. When it says he ascended, what does it mean but that he had also descended the lower parts of the earth? He who ascended is the same one who ascended far above the heavens, so that might fill all things. The gifts he gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, some scientists, some artists, some poets, some chaplains, some businessmen and women, and more, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ, until all of us come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of God, to maturity and to the measure of full stature of Christ. No longer be children, tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness in deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each working properly, promotes the body's growth in building itself up in love. So let's pray. Dear God, thank you for this Sabbath school again. And thank you to, as well, for Ron Graybill and his willingness to share with us from his life from such a great distance. We know we will be blessed by him, and we look forward to his remarks. In Christ's name, amen. Over to you, Dr. Graybill.
Okay, let me share my screen here. And let me go to a slideshow from the beginning. There we are. There we are. Now, I always say that the human memory is not a device for recalling the past, but for keeping us sane and happy in the present. So if the things I remember about my life with Ellen White are complimentary to me, that may be the reason, because I'm sure I made mistakes and errors along the way. And we hope that when someone preaches my funeral sermon, they'll overlook those and mention the good things. So anyway, my life with Ellen White, what shall I say about that? My life with Ellen White actually begins before my life began with my grandmother, Mabel Spencer. Now, she was in a devout Adventist family in Lansing, Michigan. She was about 17 when Dr. John Harvey Kellogg got embroiled in a controversy with the church over his book, The Living Temple, which, David, they said was pantheistic, and other issues. And Kellogg was disfellowshipped from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Well, the Spencer family sympathized with Kellogg, and my grandmother lost her confidence in Ellen White's prophetic gift. And although she remained a faithful Adventist all of her life, she never said anything more about Ellen White. She had eventually 12 children, all of whom survived infancy. And she ended up living out in Baldwin Park in Southern California. And she played piano for the local church, and she wrote essays about religious topics, but she never said anything about Ellen White, pro or con. Then a busybody lady came into the church, befriended her, and discovered to her horror that Mabel Ruckle was her name by that time, that Mabel Ruckle didn't believe in Ellen White. And she caused such a ruckus in the church that my dear grandmother was disfellowshipped. Well, we don't do that anymore. We have people in the Seventh-day Adventist Church who don't believe Ellen White was a true prophet. But as long as they don't disrupt the life of the church by agitating their views, we don't cast them out of the church. Anyway, I didn't really learn about my grandmother's experience until I was already deep into Ellen White studies. But my mother, Marguerite, born Marguerite Ruckle, later Marguerite Graybill, and then she married a second time to Clifford Howard, so she died as Marguerite Howard. Anyway, my mother, she didn't know quite what to make of Ellen White, and she didn't have any strong beliefs about Ellen White. Then she went to Southern California Junior College, which, as you know, became La Sierra University, and there she read a book. This book persuaded her that Ellen White was a true prophet of God. Now, this is perhaps the most miraculous thing in my whole story, because that book was Messages to Young People. Cannot believe we thought of Messages to Young People as the most depressing and awful compilation of discouraging Ellen White quotes that you could possibly find. But somehow my mother found some meaning there, and she became to be a firm believer in Ellen White's prophetic gift. I first came to consciousness. I first remember being a person and being alive when we were living in the hills outside of Placerville, California. Placerville was the home of Thomas Kincaid, whose artwork I generally loathe, but I do like this painting of the downtown Placerville, because it has the theater on this side, and right beside that theater was the barbershop where they always took me as a child to have my haircuts. And where I was most insulted by a barber who said to me, "Your hair is like barbed wire." Oh, I was hurt by that. But anyway, that's my memory of the barbershop. And if you look at the bell tower here in Placerville and the windows on this building, and then look on Google Maps and the street level view, you can see the same building and the same bell tower in Placerville today. Now, actually, oh, by the way, Placerville is also the hometown of the Heritage Singers. Now, actually, we We said we were from Placerville, but we actually live 7.5 miles outside of Placerville, north of Highway 50, the highway that leads from Sacramento up to Lake Tahoe. Today, our home is considered part of Camino, but we favored Placerville. So my uncle and my father built this sturdy cabin. I know it looks primitive, and so it did when I was a little boy. But before we left, we had improved it, and we had added an addition and a second story. And that home still stands today. In fact, the owner of this home told me that when he went into the attic to renovate and build this porch on, he said that the original framework of that little cabin was remarkably sturdy and good. That was the work of my uncle, I think. My father was a carpenter of sorts too, but my uncle a much more skilled one. So anyway, that's where I came to consciousness and where I first began to be influenced by Ellen White. I don't remember much discussion about theology or even politics in my childhood. The only debate I recall around the neighborhood was whether a Chevy or a Ford was the best car to have. Well, we had a Buick. Yes, indeed, we had a Buick. But I'll have to confess that the Buick was from 1929. So many of the Chevys and Fords around the neighborhood were much better than ours. But Ellen White certainly influenced us. Of course, we would not drink coffee. And in fact, I did not drink coffee at all in my entire life until I married a Dane. And Danish Adventists have always been a little more liberal than American Adventists. And my Danish relatives drank coffee. And so gradually I was corrupted and began to drink a little coffee now and then. But instead of coffee, we had Postum. Oh, yes, Postum. And even Postum has a remote connection with Ellen White. Here's an early ad. Begin early. Children brought up on Postum are free from the evil effects of caffeine, the habit-forming drug in coffee and tea. Postum Cereal Company, Battle Creek, Michigan. Well, it has a connection to Ellen White, because C.W. Post had come to Battle Creek as a patient, to Battle Creek Sand as a patient. And the word is that he borrowed or stole John Harvey Kellogg's recipe for cereal coffee. And Post's first product was Postum. Later came Post Toasties and the others. But there we were, free of caffeine, at least in our childhood. Now, also I recall, and this would be an influence of Ellen White, I recall our local church offered classes in edible wild plants. And what was my surprise to discover you can still earn a Pathfinder honor in edible wild plants. Back then, of course, it was not just for camping out or whatever. It was because when we had to flee to the rocks in the mountains, we needed something to eat. And so edible wild plants. And just like David mentioned his father thinking that they should move out of the city, we heard about needing to move out of the city. We didn't feel like we needed to because we were pretty much in the city, out of the city already. But even today, wait a minute, what happened? Here, even today, you have Doug Batchelor preaching about, is it time to flee the cities? Is it time to flee this? I didn't listen to this particular one. But I did listen to some of his presentations for my presentation on America, the Magic Dragon, which I think is coming up on the Branson class later. And I'll tell you more about Doug Batchelor and that sort of Adventist. Anyway, we didn't feel like we needed to flee the cities. We were living here and we had a dense forest. Where we were living was 1,000 feet higher than the American River down here. And we were sure that if we fled into this dense forest, we could escape the Sunday law enforcement troops who were coming after us. So anyway, my mother told us that Ellen White said that there were certain psalms that we should memorize, because we would need those in the time of trouble to comfort us in the time of trouble if we didn't have our Bibles. And so she said, Ellen White said you should memorize the first Psalm, the 19th, the 23rd, the 91st. And I did. I memorized them. Now later, as I studied Ellen White, I discovered that she never said that. But it helped me through some times of trouble anyway. Ellen White did say that we should memorize scripture. The mind should be trained to dwell upon scripture. Even whole chapters may be committed to memory to be, let me move this side thing here so I can see this, to be repeated when Satan comes in with his temptations. The 58th chapter of Isaiah is a profitable chapter for this purpose. So maybe I should go ahead and memorize that too. My life was also influenced by Ellen White, because Ellen White had said that you should not send children to school when they are very young. So I was not sent to school till I was 8 years old. And I ended up skipping the second grade later, and got behind on my multiplication tables and never was good at math or science after that. So maybe the fact that I ended up as a minister and a historian is because my mother cheated me out of the multiplication tables. Anyway, I don't remember much about Ellen White during elementary school, but I ended up at Newbury Park Academy, as I mentioned in our pre-discussion, and was nurtured and mentored by some wonderful teachers, Don Yost and his wife among them. He was there at that time and taught us journalism, later became archivist at the General Conference. And I think Yost is one of the early editors of Insight magazine, which will come up later also. Well, while I was at, here I am at Newbury. This is not exactly Elvis Presley's hairdo, but you can see the influence. And then while I was at Newbury, I got involved in temperance oratorical contests. Yes, indeed. And even in this one contest, I actually won out over Ron Walden, who was far more brilliant than I was. And so anyway, this persuaded me that maybe I could be a preacher. So I went on to La Sierra College and took classes in La Sierra Hall. There, I became editor of the Campus Criterion, the student newspaper, and I looked around to my theology friends to see who might write a religion column for me, and there was John Butler. So he wrote the religion column for the Campus Criterion. Here's Butler in those days. You'll see another picture of him later, quite changed, but still ruggedly handsome. Now, here's where Rick Rice comes in, because for Student Week of Prayer, it was Ron Graybill, Rick Rice, Jim Rataka, and who is this? Joanna Rudis. I don't remember her, Rick, but maybe you do. And John Butler. We were the speakers for the Student Week of Prayer at La Sierra University. Now, our Spirit of Prophecy teacher at La Sierra was J.C. Hostler. He was a very straight arrow, very conservative fellow. He used T. Housel Jemison's book, A Prophet Among You. And when a donor donated a complete set of Ellen White books to La Sierra University, J.C. Hostler saw to it that those books were placed in the game room of the student center. Only Hostler would have thought of that as the location instead of the archives in the library. So anyway, I went on to the seminary and immediately got myself into trouble over Ellen White. I wrote an article for the student newspaper called Sign Watching Produces Apathy. And this contained some passages so controversial that the student newspaper at Southern Missionary College reprinted my article, just, I think, to show what heretics we were coming out of La Sierra. Well, here's what was controversial. Back in 1856, in Testimony for the Church number 2, which is now part of volume 1, Mrs. White was shown that the company present at this conference and said the angel, some food for worms, some subject to the 7 last plagues, and some will be alive and remain upon the earth to be translated at the coming of Jesus. Well, of course, I had to say boldly in my article in the Student, Ellen White was wrong. Now, of course, I think I went on, I hope I went on to talk about conditional prophecy, but I said Ellen White was wrong. Well, an alumnus of Southern Missionary College got wind of this article, and he was a General Conference president who watched very closely everything that was going on in the church, even student newspaper articles. And so when Robert Pearson visited Andrews University, I was called into the president's office, and I was sat down with Robert Pearson in a little office off of Richard Hamill's office. And there he labored with me about my views on Ellen White. And he assured me as we parted, Ron, he said, there are, Brother Graybill, he probably called me, Brother Graybill, there are still some of us who believe that that Jesus is coming very soon. That was 54 years ago that I was assured by Robert Pearson that Jesus was coming very soon. But the person who influenced me most to study Ellen White at the seminary was Roy Branson. We took ethics from him, and he suggested that if we would look into the historical backgrounds of Ellen White's statements on race relations, statements which were controversial because she essentially urged segregation, if we would look into those backgrounds, we would we would understand them much better. So I wrote a master's thesis on the topic, and that became the book Ellen G. White and Church Race Relations. Then I went on to write the book Mission to Black America, which has just recently been reprinted. You can buy it from a little plug here. You can buy it from Amazon, sure. And anyway, those 2 books persuaded Arthur White that he should invite me to come to the White estate and serve as his research assistant as he worked on his 6-volume biography of Ellen White. We actually started out with the Elmshaven years first because I had interviewed a few people who still remembered those years. As time went on, Arthur White got more and more involved in other things, and I got more and more involved in other things. So I didn't really help him much on the first 3 volumes of the biography. But here is Arthur White in the vault at the Ellen White estate. And there was the big Bible, the Harmon family Bible, which was always shown to the people who came through the White estate in those days. I arrived at the General Conference just in late in 1970, just as the last issue of the Use Instructor was coming from the press, and the first issue of Insight magazine replaced it just a few weeks later. And so I took to writing for Insight magazine, and over the years I wrote many articles for Insight and other magazines, and just recently I've started to gather those all together into a PDF publication, which I'm calling Life Works in Adventist History. And if you send me an email, I'll probably send you a copy of these for free as I put them together. I'm still waiting for a few articles to be copied in the archives before I can finish this project. So my early articles about Ellen White in those years were not controversial. I wrote about the courtship of Ellen Harmon. I wrote about foot washing and fanatics. And that begins to get a little bit edgy because we hadn't talked much about fanaticism in the Millerite and the early Adventist, early Adventist movement. But then I wrote about D.M. Canright in Healdsburg and began to touch on the plagiarism charge. Of course, after I married in 1967 in Denmark, I got interested in Ellen White in Denmark and wrote an article for Adventist Heritage about Ellen White in Copenhagen. She actually describes Copenhagen more thoroughly than any other city she ever visited. You know, she went to San Francisco, but all of her California friends had been to San Francisco. They hadn't been to Copenhagen. And so she described the sights and sounds and things that she saw in Copenhagen. And I included those in this article about Ellen White in Copenhagen. Then I wrote about early Adventist use of the Apocrypha. And of course, that research has been recently very much updated and superseded by research done by Kevin Burton, who has done so much with Adventist use of the Apocrypha. I wrote more about enthusiasm in early Adventist worship, which I casually suggested is a backdrop for Ellen White's early ecstatic visions. And then I wrote about the editing of the testimonies, these two articles in Ministry magazine. Those were not particularly controversial, but when I started writing about historical difficulties in the Great Controversy and supporting Don McAdams' work showing that Ellen White had made historical errors in the Great Controversy, and when I started writing about Ellen White's role in doctrine formation and so on, I began to have some conflicts with Arthur White. I always respected Arthur White, and even after I left, I had no resentment against Arthur White. But you know, his life was bound up in his stories about Ellen White. And so when I wrote an essay suggesting that the evidence for Ellen holding the Big Bible was possibly not as good as it should be, he was very much offended. I actually showed the Big Bible myself when I was taking groups through about, but I said, as the story has come down to us. And finally, in Spectrum, Spectrum, recently, I didn't put the, oh, where's the date? Here we go. In 2015, I laid out all the evidence about the Big Bible and the history of the Big Bible too, because it's an interesting book, quite apart from Ellen White's role in that. I got into further hot water with Arthur White when I started writing about the Salamanca vision and suggested that Ellen White backdated some of her entries about the Salamanca vision. So this shows the pages of the diary. What is in green is what Ellen White wrote actually in November of 1890. And she left all these areas that are pink, she left blank. And then after the events of the General Conference in 1891, she went back and inserted all of this material back into the, in and around the November 1890, and this described events which did not take place until March of 1891. Now, I've written about that and explained that. Otherwise, at this point, I simply want to say that it naturally caused Arthur White to be very upset with me. And if you want to read my latest on that, you need to go to Adventist Heritage in the summer of 2020, where I had the rest of the story of Salamanca, solving the mysterious diary dates. Let me just say that Ellen White, the events that happened in March of 1891 reminded Ellen White of a vision she had received back in November of 1890. And she believed that she had not understood that vision, and she believed that she was justified in dating that vision and a larger expansion of that vision back into her diary of 1890. But anyway, you need to read that article to discuss that. Now, I did some things at the White Estate that were not entire, do not look to me to be entirely honorable. I was a friend with Ron Numbers. I knew he was working on Prophetess of Health. I suggested that he look for certain sources that he might never have found had I not put him on to that. So naturally, when he published the book and I described him as a wildly irresponsible historian, he was much offended because he knew that I had supported his work on that. And I have more recently apologized for using that intemperate phrase about him, and he accepted my apology, which was great. What happened was Dick Schwartz and I were sent up to Madison to sit down with Ron Numbers and go through the book. And wherever Schwartz and I both agreed that Numbers should make a change, he did make a change. So it was actually a book more acceptable to at least Schwartz and I than it had been before we went to work on it. Then, of course, I went off to school, even as I was working at the White Estate at Johns Hopkins University, studied with Timothy Smith, the author of the famous Revivalism and Social Reform. And I wrote a dissertation, and my dissertation was called The Power of Prophecy, Ellen White and the Women Religious Founders of the 19th Century, about Mary Baker Eddy and Catherine Booth and others. Anyway, I'm not sure where to tell the story of the dissertation. What happened was University Microfilms was not supposed to distribute copies of any dissertations for 1 year after receiving them. That was to give the authors time to revise them and publish them. But Doug Hackelman requested a copy almost as soon as it arrived at University Microfilms, and University Microfilms, without checking to see that the dissertation was restricted, sent a copy to Hackelman, and he published some of the juiciest passages in his book, in his magazine, Adventist Currents. Well, then I went to work on the dissertation and made some changes to try to show Bob Olson, who was in charge then, and Arthur White and so on, that this dissertation was not need not be as controversial as Doug Hackelman had made it appear. And when I gave Olson the revised copy of the dissertation, I told him that it had been changed. So I was not duplicitous. I did not try to deceive him. I did not tell him what the changes were, but I told him that it had been changed. But later then, when they learned when they saw the actual dissertation, they felt that they had been somewhat misled by the earlier one. And the fact of the matter is that the dissertation has at last been published. You can buy it in almost its exact early form from Amazon now. I'll say more about that dissertation and the controversy over that as we go along. The best account of my departure from the White Estate is in this March 1984 Spectrum article by Bonnie Casey, Graybill's Exit. And some people who have been writing about my experience since then have not consulted that and not honored that as they should. Of course, my humorous friends had to do cartoons here showing me the last moves will be rapid ones with Neil Wilson pushing the button to send me down there. And then some others of artistic inclination showed this. And this is the way Ellen White, this is the way my dear wife actually pictured me in those days, as almost married to Ellen. Later in my life, there was a 30-year period when I didn't pay much attention to Ellen White, but that came much later. The thing about the dissertation that one of the reasons why I was dismissed from the White Estate over the dissertation was because I used passages from the Lucinda Hall letters, which had not been officially released by the White Estate. And the most controversial of those was in a letter where Ellen White quoted some unkind things that James White had written to her in a letter. She quoted those in a letter to Lucinda. What she had written was, what James had written, according to Ellen White's account, James had said, "I shall use the old head God gave me until he reveals I am wrong. Your head won't fit my shoulders. Keep it where it belongs, and I will try to honor God by using my own." Now, I actually went on in the dissertation to show how Ellen White tried to mollify James and apologize. And she said, "It grieves me that I have said or written anything to grieve you. Forgive me, and I'll be cautious not to start any subject to annoy or distress you." And this was one of the, because I used unauthorized, unreleased Ellen White materials in my dissertation, was one of the reasons given why I was dismissed from the White Estate. The other reason, as explained by Neil Wilson himself in an article, was that my views had simply diverged from those of my colleagues sufficiently that it was not fitting for me to continue in the White Estate. And Neil Wilson arranged for me to continue in denominational employment. I went on to Homesteading Institute and then to the Columbia Union as editor of their paper. And at the Columbia Union, I continued to write about Ellen White, of course, Ellen White in the Columbia Union. And then years later, in 1891, I went back to my interest in Ellen White's holographic or handwritten material and wrote an article called "The Meaning of Misspelled Words: Scholars, Churchmen, and the Writings of Ellen G. White." And of course, I've recently returned to that topic too. I believe, and I have expanded that in my recent book, that there are things to be learned. Not a lot, but things to be learned from looking at how Ellen White initially wrote in her own hand, and what she said and how she expressed herself in her own hand. There are things to be learned that we don't learn from the polished, edited versions provided by her literary assistants. Now, this is not the polished version. This is a literal transcript. And down here, you see that what Ellen White actually wrote was, there must be no political speeches. There must be no careless movements to be found. The whites mingling with the blacks in free and easy association. For charges have been given to find occasion to stop the work of the churches. This was said at a time when to do so would have invoked mob violence. Well, Clarence Chrysler, her literary assistant at that time, transcribed this free and easy association to say the mingling of whites and blacks in social equality was by no means to be encouraged. Now, when you talk about discouraging social equality, you get into a very racist sounding sort of expression. And I think we can learn and improve our view of Ellen White by going back to what she originally wrote. And so in the last spectrum, I have written, let's see, where is this? This is, 2021. I've written The Last Secrets of the White Estate. And that is about the secrets that you can learn by looking at Ellen White's handwritten documents, and urging that in different ways those handwritten documents be made more accessible. In 2013, I wrote a centennial history of the White Memorial Medical Center. And in the course of that, I got very much interested in a painting of Ellen White that hangs in the lobby of the White Memorial Medical Center. At first, I didn't like it, but then I learned that it was painted by a Jewish Christian convert, Peter Plotkin. And Plotkin is the only one who put in Hebrew and English the Sabbath commandment next to Ellen White. Now, he made one historical mistake because he put a quill pen on Ellen White's writing table. And of course, she never used a quill pen. She used steel tip pens and fountain pens, but never a quill pen. But anyway, that painting was very fascinating to me. In 2014, the Ellen White Encyclopedia came out. Now, I did not have any articles in it, but I was the second most cited author in the footnotes. George Knight was the most frequently cited, but I was cited even more than Merlin Burt and more than Michael Campbell, for which I was proud. I have only two objections to the encyclopedia, and one is Michael Hazel's article on Ellen White's use as history, in which he tries to defend his father's view that Ellen White made no historical errors in the Great Controversy, in the Huss chapter of the Great Controversy. And then I also, in Merlin Burt's bibliographic essay, he mentions me being dismissed from the White Estate because I tried to hide my use of unreleased materials by writing a version of the dissertation that didn't include those unreleased materials. Well, that is not true. That is not true. The revised or changed version of the dissertation that I first gave to Bob Olson and told him it was changed included all of those quotes from the unreleased material. In fact, the only change I made in that early draft, that first revision of the dissertation, the only change I made that really offended people was that I dropped Roy Branson's name out of the credits in the introduction, knowing that Kenneth Wood considered Roy Branson as the epitome of evil. And of course, that was horrifying that I would try to deceive them that Roy Branson actually had a hand in my dissertation. Well, the Don McAdams problem is going to be rectified because Don McAdams is soon to publish his paper on Ellen White and the Protestant historians. We're working on a tentative title, Ellen White and the Historians, a Neglected Problem and a Forgotten Answer. And in that will be his triple columns and essays by myself and others, as well as McAdams' revised look at the Huss manuscript and what we learned from it about Ellen White. Now, as a part of my research for the centennial history of the White Memorial, I got in touch with a woman who was a daughter of one of the early physicians. She found a photograph. She didn't know who it was. She thought it might be Ellen White, and she sent a picture of it to me and asked me if it was, and indeed it was. And I was thus able to find a previously unknown photograph of Ellen White. Another photograph that shows that Ellen White is not nearly so straight-laced as she's depicted to be, especially in her later life, because here she is with these fancy, and her daughter-in-law with these fancy Edwardian hats on. Anyway, so that was another discovery. I have also continued to collect paintings and drawings and cartoons and caricatures of Ellen White. I find this one, which appeared in the guide recently, to be especially fascinating because the light from heaven is not coming into Ellen White's mind, but it's shining on the book that she's reading. That's interesting. And then there are other caricatures of Ellen White, unbelievable characters which are out there, including you can buy a t-shirt, I believe, in Ellen G. White. And in this era of COVID, a mask. Who would wear this? My goodness. As some of you know, I meet weekly with John Butler, Gil Valentine, Fritz Guy, and we discuss Ellen White. We even made ourselves a coffee mug to celebrate our discussion of Ellen White and other prophets. We used to meet at Starbucks, but we've been meeting virtually since then. And we get into lots of interesting topics and review lots of literature and have lots of fun recalling the early days. My latest book, Visions and Revisions, a textual history of Ellen White's writings, really covers a lot of the topics that I've been mentioning here, controversial topics. And thanks to Alberto Valenzuela, the editor at Pacific Press, he translated the book into Spanish. And very soon, Jonathan Butler, here's what he looks like today. Jonathan Butler will be reviewing the book in Adventist Today. Now, as I conclude, I want to give you a preview of a discussion that I'm going to have on Branson Sabbath School in October. Very quickly, David, very quickly. Back in 1977, I wrote an article called Adventist Historic Witness Against Creeds, but I didn't use my name. I used the name William Wright. And even my colleagues today never knew who William Wright was until I revealed that I was the author of that article. This is when the General Conference was agitating about needing a new statement of fundamental beliefs. And of course, as you know, I suggested the wording that became the preamble to that statement of fundamental beliefs. Although I'm the only one that ever uses, or the word preamble is never associated with that statement in any official Adventist publication. And in fact, when the first commentary on the fundamental beliefs came out, edited by Gerard Darmsey, the preamble was not even mentioned, nor is it mentioned in the 2012 Inter-American Division commentary on the fundamental beliefs, nor was it mentioned online when you download the PDF on the fundamental beliefs from the General Conference website now. The preamble is not even mentioned. But, wait a minute, thankfully, the church manual, which is the official record of the fundamental beliefs, the church manual does include, finally, the preamble. Well, the preamble was really seen as unwelcome by the Standish brothers. In their book, The 28 Fundamentals, Apostasy Proclaimed in Silence, they refer to what is unofficially known as the Graybill Preamble. As it is written, it is difficult to take issue with this preamble, but as used by the liberal element of our church, it has become a snare. It has largely been interpreted to mean in liberal circles that when the laity and leadership have lost their hold on truth, the 27 fundamentals are ripe for alterations, which reflect more openly the tenets of the new theology. Now, ironically, all of the changes that have been made in the fundamental beliefs since 1980 have been in the direction of making them more conservative, not more liberal, except for one. And I'll get into that one when we bring this up in October. So now I'm going to stop sharing and come back to converse with you folks.
Wow, that's tremendous. It's a fascinating story, beginning with your grandmother, and then your mother, and then you. So it's a complicated story, isn't it? Sort of a 1 foot in, 1 foot out all the way along. Now, we have many questions, and we will convene here in about 10 minutes. But next week, Ron will be back with us to talk about what?
Oh, is that when we're doing the
Puff the Magic Dragon.
oh yes, America, the Magic Dragon.
Okay, America the Magic Dragon. So he'll be here again with us on July 3, 1 week from today, and then again on October 23, when he will talk specifically about that preamble, which many people think is the most important part of the whole thing. So yeah, we'll have a good conversation about that as well. So let's take about 10 minutes, and that would mean we would reconvene at 11:30 or so, and then we'll have questions and comments. Those who want to say something, be sure to let Forrest Howe know by raising your hand, either physically or mechanically. There's Ed Turner has his hand up, I see.
Yeah.
Already.
Do we want to wait until after the break, or do you want to start now, or what, David?
Okay, let's take a break, and then we'll survey the group to see who wants to speak at that point. Is that all right?
That's great. And then just raise your hand and I'll be watching for you. And if you wave $100 bill, I'll see that you get out early. So anyway, okay. So what, 12:30 or 11:30 be back? Or what?
Yeah, 11:30.
11:30, okay.
9-minute break.
Surgical assistant,
Mhm.
and he wanted Sabbath off, and everybody wanted to go to church on Sunday, so they were fine, with switching over to get his Sabbath off, and he'd work
Yeah.
Sunday
Yeah.
because the people.
By the way, Sue, my wife's foster grandfather was from Menominee, Wisconsin. And they
What?
used to say, Grandpa, would you spell Menominee? And he go, M-E-N-E-M-O. He never could quite make it.
The way we remember it is me no money.
Me no money.
Me no money.
Well,
David, I
welcome
think
back,
we're-
Saints. Here we go. I have a request for Ron right up front, and then I would like to be put in the queue for later on. Okay, but first of all, Ron, are you with us already?
Yeah, I'm here. I've been
Okay.
here all the time.
Okay, I would like you to, if you don't mind, go back to the story of your dissertation and quickly review what you said, because what I have been told is that you submitted one copy of your dissertation to the microfilm people, or even to the university, one copy of the dissertation to Johns Hopkins, and another one to the White Estate, and that they were intentionally different in
That I excised the quotations, the unreleased quotations from the copy that I gave to Bob Olson, so that it didn't look like I used any unreleased material. That's not true. I have a copy of the revised and the original, and the revised has all the unreleased quotations in it. So whatever happened, it was certainly not as deceptive as it has been made to appear afterwards. But when they saw that I left Roy Branson out, they were just generally suspicious of the whole thing.
Interesting, huh? So you had credited Roy Branson in the Johns Hopkins, but you left it out in the one to the White Estate?
The first one to the White Estate, yeah, I quickly gave them the other one, you know, and that's what, and so when they paged through and saw that Branson was not in there in the first one and was in the other one, and then they were offended more than they probably would have been if I'd left Branson in all together all along. Yeah,
let me make sure I've got this. Go ahead.
It was a stupid thing to do, okay? It was a stupid thing to do. But I've also said many times that, as Neil Wilson explained, there was an incompatibility between my views of Ellen White and my colleagues' views of Ellen White, which necessitated my departure from the White Estate. That is true. And I should have resigned from the White Estate well before any of this happened. But hindsight is 20/20.
Yeah, okay. So did the White Estate get both versions of the dissertation in due course?
Oh yeah, very soon.
Well, what's the problem?
The problem was that I had given them a copy that was changed from the copy that Hopkins had, and that had a change in it that looked like I was trying to deceive them by not admitting that Roy Branson had a hand in my I better go back. I have both copies, and I have Microsoft Compare function. Before October, I should do the research. I should do the research and get a copy, a red line version. I can get a red line version of the dissertation that shows exactly what changes were made between the first and the second version.
Okay.
And then even I can speak with more authority on the issue.
Okay, but that Roy's name figured prominently in this is fascinating. I had not known that. Okay, over to you, Forrest.
Okay, thank you, David. I would like to go now to Ed Turner.
Yeah, thank you, Ron, for a great presentation, and also your latest book, which I thoroughly enjoyed. This is in response to David's statement to what are the earliest recollections that we can remember about Ellen White. And as many of you know, I'm a preacher's kid. I was born and raised in the church. And at the age of 7, my parents became missionaries to South Africa. And I can remember, I think it was about 1951 in Cape Town, South Africa. In the church there, Arthur White came to make a presentation. And he brought a lot of stuff, and he was in the front of the church. And I remember this table specifically with a white tablecloth on it. And he had the big Bible there, and he had manuscripts and a lot of other things. And he held up the Bible, and I can recall at the end, he invited us to come forward to look at this and all these items. And I remember we were there at the table, and some people reached out to, hold some of these things, and they were forbidden. These were like relics, and you could not touch them. And that was just an interesting recollection of a boy that was 10 years old at the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. That's fascinating.
Okay, Sue Lewis. Well, and again, welcome from Wisconsin.
Thank you. You mentioned the early Adventist use of the Apocrypha. I wasn't aware that they used it quite a bit. And so I wondered what their view of the Apocrypha was in those early days. Did they see it as just extra scriptural, but some things were good, so we'll use those because Jude did too. I don't know.
They were a little ambiguous on it, and they gave it a little less status, but they quoted it right along with scripture, with canonical scripture passages to prove points. And when James White annotated Ellen White's first vision by putting scripture footnotes in, he included footnotes to the Apocrypha. And we find echoes of the Apocrypha in Ellen White's account of her first vision. As I said, I'm no longer the expert on this, and I will by next week. I can get a reference to the latest information about early Adventist use of the Apocrypha. But yeah, Ellen White said, I hope I can quote her correctly, the Apocrypha is a hidden book, but the redeemed of these last days should understand it. The Bible is the standard book which will judge us, you see. So the Bible was given, the canonical Bible was given greater status than the Apocrypha, but the Apocrypha was quoted early on, right along with that. And then as time went by, yeah, and as you know, the Big Bible included the Apocrypha. It's interesting that I've done a great study of extant versions of the Big Bible, and some copies have the Apocrypha and some copies do not. And often the title page says that the Bible includes the Apocrypha, and yet that Bible will not include the Apocrypha. Well, what happened is people subscribed to this publication, and they would get signatures over time as Joseph Teal published them. And they might get a signature which included a particular woodcut or a particular etching. And they really liked that etching. And so instead of having it bound into their Bible, they would frame it and put it on their wall. And that's why every version of the Big Bible, there are about 47 of them that are currently extant in various libraries around the world, every version has different plates, different etchings. And you can have copies that say it includes the Apocrypha, but it doesn't. So that particular family, they probably said, we don't think the Apocrypha should be in our Bible. And so they didn't take it to the binder to have their Bible bound.
Okay, I might mention, Sue, we had a long discussion on the Apocrypha, several months ago. I think if you went to YouTube and looked the Roy Branson class up, you would find some of our discussion on the Apocrypha. Matthew Cortman has discussed it. But
Oh, yeah, maybe.
What?
Yeah, he's another one that discusses it. Yeah.
So anyway, we have a discussion here. If you can't find it, we'll be glad to help you find some of that discussion. But great question.
Thank you.
Great question. Okay, I want to go to Bob Ford. Bob?
Hello there, Ron.
Hi there.
I really enjoyed, I listened last night to your YouTube presentation with this other Adventist historian about your work on racism and particularly what happened in the South of the United States. And I just want, I don't know if you remember or not, but back in 1969-70, I went to do a master's in sociology with Betty Sterling in Loma Linda, and then I went on to School of Public Health. But for my thesis, I did a survey, a public survey of racial attitudes of Adventist ministers in California. Actually, I don't even know if I still have a copy of it, but I remember talking with you because you shortly after that, I think in '71, wrote a book dealing with some of the early racial issues in our church. And so I was wondering are you continuing to follow up on some of those issues? Because I think it's an interesting history. And I really appreciate what you did to help our church understand the issues of racism. And another little history. My grandfather on my mother's side went to Madison College in the early 1920s to be the builder of the college with E.O. Sutherland. And they knew a lot of Edson White's work in the South and some of the issues that dealt with, how dealing with the Black Adventist Church and the White Adventist Church and the rise of the Jim Crow era. And it was always interesting. It was actually the history. My mother grew up there at Madison College, lived in a duplex. On the other side of the duplex was Neil Wilson's parents, and they grew up together. And I always remember my mother talking about what it was like to grow up in the Deep South. And I know that you took a trip down through the South to look at some of Adventism and so on. And I'm wondering, are you following up on any of that? Because I think it's so important in our era today, where Black Lives Matter, the whole issue of racism and how it may be affecting our church. Do you have any comments about what we could learn today from what you learned back then in the 60s and 70s when you were exploring that topic?
Well, frankly, I don't continue to do research in that area. And one of the reasons is because Doug Morgan at Washington Adventist University and Benjamin Baker are the experts on that. Benjamin Baker on Black Adventism and all these racial issues too. And then and Ben Baker maintains a website about Black Adventist history. But Douglas Morgan has really studied, and he has this book out. In fact, I don't know, he may be presented today for the Asheville, North Carolina Adventist Forum. I don't know if they record that, but on his book about the heroes in the racial changes that took place in our church. So I have passed that baton to Doug Morgan and Benjamin Baker.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'll go look at that Asheville Forum and see what they say.
Okay.
It was that history that actually got me interested to do my sociology thesis with Betty Sterling on racism. It was kind of learning from my mother and my father and my grandfather, what it was like to be an Adventist in the South. So it's an interesting history. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, I would like to ask you a question, Ron. Would you comment on how Seventh-day Adventists deal with the concept of prophetess and Ellen White? How are they similar and different from other groups like Mormons, Christian Science, Swedenborgians, etc.?
Well, I can comment only briefly on that. I think again, we need to wait for a book by David Holland. David Holland is a Mormon scholar. He is on the faculty now at the Harvard Divinity School. And David Holland is working on a joint biography of Ellen White and Mary Baker Eddy, which would be very interesting. And I'm sure he'll deal with that because he's, of course, being a Mormon historian, or a Mormon and a historian, he'll have something interesting to say. But our reflections in our little Thursday morning group with Butler and Valentine and Fritz Guy have always been that Mormons' view of Joseph Smith's inspiration gives Joseph Smith's writings much more authority in their doctrines than Adventists attribute to Ellen White. Now, I know we say that Ellen White has seized hermeneutical control of our interpretations, but the Mormons just frankly say that Joseph Smith's writings are on an equal par to the Bible, and they're an extension of the Bible and the completion of the Bible, and they give the exact same level of authority to Joseph Smith's writings that they do to the Bible. But we don't. Now, I don't know about Swedenborg and the others, but I know Joseph Smith is elevated more than Ellen White. And I know that Adventists still have something of a problem balancing Ellen White's authority with the authority of Scripture. And if I should say something heretical here, I kind of I should say that the only change in what I consider a more liberal direction in our fundamental beliefs was this 2015 change in the statement about the spirit of prophecy, where instead of using Delafield's phrase that Ellen White is, I forget the exact words. Anyway, the new one is Ellen White speaks with prophetic authority. Good. Ellen White speaks with prophetic authority. Prophetic authority is a spiritual authority. It is not a historical authority. It is not a scientific authority, not a geological authority. She speaks with prophetic authority, and he helps us to understand things spiritually, not to understand the age of the rocks. If we want to understand the age of the rocks, if that's your question, then answer it with the research that people have studied the age of the rocks. If you want to understand the spiritual meaning of the rocks, then read Ellen White.
Can we just piggyback on that? How do Mormons deal with divergent views, and especially those who hold those views? Could this gentleman who is at Harvard still be at BYU, or would that be verboten?
Well, no, I think he could. His father was actually one of the 12 apostles, you know, and it was maybe even a president at BYU. I forget exactly what his credentials were, but he is he's a little like Richard Bushman. You know, Richard Bushman was a very famous historian of Puritan New England. And yet Richard Bushman was a devout Mormon, and he's now written this biography of Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. And there are Mormons who sort of question whether Bushman should have dared to say what he did about Joseph Smith. And yet my wife and I have been listening to Rough Stone Rolling as we take our evening walks and try to get our 10,000 steps in. And again, we shake our heads and say, how can anybody believe this stuff? And then we remind ourselves that people are looking at some of the Adventist doctrines and saying, how could anybody believe this stuff? But in my Adventist mind, Joseph Smith has a lot more to answer for than Ellen White. But no, I think that David Holland is a very good historian, and I think that I think he probably could teach at BYU. Of course, he's not doing a joint biography of Ellen White and Joseph Smith. That would be interesting. He's doing one of Ellen White and Mary Baker Eddy.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you. David, I think I'm going to come to you right now. You're muted, David.
This is a two-part question, Ron, and it goes back to my academy days. And I think someone from the White estate, it may have been Arthur White, came and told us a story about a lost hairnet, which somehow was located through the ministry of Ellen White. And at that time, I had two reactions. One was, I doubted that it actually happened. So historically, I had some doubts. But secondly, and more importantly, it seemed to me to be out of character, out of fit, namely that we should not base our beliefs on miracles, that we should base our beliefs on the weight of the evidence. And for that reason, I have wondered why the white estate has made such an issue of these miraculous events, whatever they were, holding up the Bible or finding the hairnet or whatever, not breathing when she's in vision. Seems to me that all of that is theologically irrelevant, maybe even distracting on White's own terms. Why then does the white estate do that?
Well, first of all, I think the white estate doesn't do it as much now as it used to in the past, number one. Number two, the white estate does say, that these are not the proofs that we should rely on, but stories like that about the Big Bible are so physical, or so dramatic, or so visible that they're hard to resist. In fact, Arthur White got away with himself when he was indignantly replying to my paper where I suggested that the historical evidence for the Big Bible was not as sound as it might be. And he said something like, anyone who has seen the look of faith come over the face of young people when they hear this story would never question the story of the Big Bible. I thought, oh boy, that is a specious argument. But anyway, but I do think that they don't emphasize it as much. And if you read carefully, the best of the accounts of those sorts of things, I think they don't. Ted Lester was on, and he may be able to confirm that. But I do need to tell you a couple of little humorous story about the Big Bible. As Arthur White traveled from place to place, and whenever he would come to a college or an academy, the students, after a while, the students would know that was going to come up. And so he was coming to Walla Walla one time, and one of the students who was quite strong and who worked in the wood shop, he knew that Arthur White would often call on the strongest boy in the school to come up and see how long he could hold the Big Bible. And the record, I think, was about 2.5 minutes, something like that. But this boy went into the wood shop and he built a framework under his shirt, under his coat, that would put a brace up under his arm. And so when they called for volunteers to do this, he volunteered. He came up and he started holding the Big Bible. And before long, he had exceeded the 2.5 minutes. And he went on. And finally, the students started laughing. And finally, it was revealed that he had a mechanical device in there. Well, probably wasn't a very wise thing to do, because in those days, you were not supposed to be disrespectful of those stories or of those general conference officials. And that young man was dismissed from the school for that prank. So he suffered. Now, I don't know, I think he came back and went on to a good career in the church. It reminds me of the situation at the Oakwood student strike in the 1930s. The students who led the Oakwood student strike were demanding a black president for Oakwood. Those students were all theology majors. They were all kicked out of school, and they were all told that they would never have a place in the work of the church. Every single one except one, all of them came back, finished their education, and all of them became prominent leaders in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They were just early on exercising their leadership talents and so on. So even though my grandmother got kicked out, she remained a faithful Adventist, and I enjoyed her legacy.
Ron, can I add something?
Well, I don't know. Forrest, is that Ted? Let Ted.
Yeah, just as long as he doesn't say anything about soccer, we're going to be okay.
Well, I do something about baseball. Just to add something to David's question, actually, early Adventists did not purposefully use the supernatural phenomena, as they call it, or the miraculous because of circumstances. There were a lot of people claiming this supernatural, revelations and miraculous, whatever. So until the late 1860s, David, they didn't use it. What happened is in the 1860s, you have the first critics of Ellen White, and they began to claim, you see, look at the arguments. There's nothing supernatural about Ellen White. And so you have James White now shooting a letter through Facebook, through Zoom, Review and Herald, right? And saying, hey guys, if you have witnessed my wife's visions, send me some reports of supernatural things. So prompted by the critics, by the late, I think it's 1868 or something there, 1869, they began for the first time to describe some of those supernatural things that they have seen with Ellen White. So that's a little kind of a background story.
Well, yes.
Wow,
They
that's
didn't use
fascinating.
it in the beginning.
And Ted, you cover this in your dissertation or your book?
Yes,
do you?
I have it in my dissertation, but the book is very example or two, but in my dissertation you can find a lot of that documentation there.
Yeah, he studied about how the earliest believers came to believe that Ellen White was a true prophet. Yeah, and I had forgotten that too. But I'm now listening to a book about spiritualism, and of course the spiritualists were out there claiming all kinds of miraculous things, which would lead the Adventists to say, no, we don't want to get into this business of table turning and voices in the night. And
well, there's a book by Ann Taves called Fits, Visions, and Trances, something like that. Describes a lot of, and it's a historical documentation. It's not like, oh, somebody told me. I mean, she deals with historical documents. So it's an interesting phenomena. And I really believe, Ron, as you said, I mean, a lot of the examples that you give come from the, 1960s and 50s, whatever, when we really, I think, did such a injustice to Ellen White and the whole, gift of the spirit phenomena. And I think that if we go back earlier enough, we can get a much healthier perception of how they viewed Ellen White. So,
well, I need to look at that again, because I did notice, Jan Loughborough is the one who is most fond of all these miracle stories. And Jan Loughborough is the first one to suggest, well, I may be wrong on this, but one of these, it was some time before anybody suggested that Ellen White spoke audible words while not breathing. You know what I mean? So that whole thing developed over time too. But anyway, we've gone through stages in the view of the miracles.
But by the way, Laura, did you want to comment about your chat comment, your experience with the Big Bible?
Who?
Laura.
Oh, I can.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I have a mask on. I was only saying that my children visited the White Estate within the last 12 years as elementary school children, and they were encouraged to hold a large Bible. I'm sure it was not the Bible that Ellen White owned, but the strongest boy that was there was asked if he would like to try to hold it up above his head and to see how long he could hold it. Now, like I say, I'm sure it was another book, not her Bible, but that was within the last 12 years that happened. And so even though that may be something that was done years ago and certainly was more popular in the 60s and 70s when I was a child, it has not entirely fallen out of favor, and was something that happened quite recently. That's all I had to say.
Well, let me speak. It depends on how the narrator presents it. As I said, when I was there, and even as I had doubts about the Bible, I did present it and said it was a story that had come down to us. And then I think I even mentioned, that we wished there were better things. In terms of the Bible that they held, the White Estate does have the original Harmon family copy of Joseph Steele's 1822 Columbian Pulpit and Family Bible. It's in a glass case on display. But the Bible that the visitors hold is another copy, an identical copy of Joseph Steele's 1822 Bible. The White Estate actually owns. There in Washington, I think they actually have at least 3 copies. And in support of your argument that it's still being used, the White Estate has gone out and purchased copies of the Big Bible for all of the 22 research centers around the world at Adventist universities and headquarters.
I do think it's funny that
That's
we
amazing.
continue to perpetuate a story like this. And I really appreciate David asking that question, whether this was really the way to talk about Ellen White, or any of the early, or anything about Adventism really, in terms of extravagant miracles. Is that the way to talk about our religion at all? And yet it has been done. It continues to be done, I think.
Okay.
Well, even
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman.
Okay,
Just as a comment on that, for us, in Latin America, where I grew up, and even today, I know in Costa Rica, where there's an Adventist Ellen G. White library, there is a very strong tendency among many of the conservative members to elevate many of these stories about Ellen G. White. So I'd be interested in hearing what Ron says about how the overseas church is reacting today to Ellen G. White versus maybe say here in North America or Europe. Is there a difference in their perspective?
Well, I know nothing about that. I don't travel even much in the United States, and there are others who are taking greater interest. I think David Trim at the archives and others have begun to take a great deal more interest in the Adventism today. And of course, Ron Larson has traveled some overseas and noted different, he has an interesting presentation on animism, Adventist and animist cultures, and so on. But I have another view of the Big Bible. Let's say that the Big Bible story is a myth. But you know, anthropologists look at myths in all kinds of cultures, and they find that myths contain truths. And so the idea that Ellen White elevated the Bible physically, we need to emphasize that she elevated the Bible in her writings and in her recommendations of where we should place the Bible and so on. But in any culture, primitive or modern, it's just hard to get away from a good story.
Okay, thank you, Ron. I'm going to come to Peter. Peter. Okay.
I'm on.
Yes, you're on.
Okay. Thank you, Ron, for the presentation. I have a comment and a question in connection with the Big Bible. Ted forgot to mention that in the Heritage Department at Loma Linda, there is an exact edition of the Big Bible. It's approximately 19.5 pounds heavy. But I believe that it's even more important, in addition to the physical aspect of the Bible. I mean, how long somebody can hold a 19.5 pound Bible in his hand, above his head, as Ellen White supposedly did. But another important aspect in relation with that is the fact that when Ellen White held the Bible above her head, she was pointing out different texts. And my question is in relation with that, in your article, when you studied this problem, did you find any proof that she was pointing out certain texts.
This is I'm glad you mentioned this, because this explains the origins of the big Bible story. Actually, Ellen White held a number of Bibles in vision, and only in the case of the big Bible did the legend develop that it was a remarkable feat of strength. During a vision at the Otis Nichols home in Massachusetts, she held a smaller Bible, a quarto Bible. The big Bible is actually 18.5 pounds. The big Bible is a folio Bible. A quarto Bible is half that size. She held a quarto Bible, he held it open, and according to an eyewitness account written just within 15 years of that event, she pointed to texts and quoted them correctly. I think that J.N. Loughborough confused the Randolph Bible, the Otis Nichols Bible, with the big Bible, and that's where he came up with the story of her holding the big Bible in vision. And he didn't publish the story of the big Bible being held in vision was not recorded until nearly 50 years after the event supposedly took place. And I think, as you just did, Loughborough, and as many people easily do, Loughborough confused the story of the Randolph Bible with the story of the big Bible, and recalled interviewing Ellen White's sister and mother and say, oh yeah, I guess, oh, they must have told me about that. And so he records it that way. And as I say, the human memory is, well, even, let me put it this way, even Arthur White said of J.N. Loughborough, Loughborough often relied on his memory, and his memory did not serve him well. So there you have it.
Thank you.
That's a gem.
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, okay. I don't have any other questions. I do have another question if I can ask it, but I don't want to take it away from somebody else here.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Ron, regardless of the story, if it's true or not, or Loughborough, and I think you explained he may have well mixed the two events. What should be the Adventist overall attitude towards the miraculous, miraculous physical phenomena with Ellen White? What is your perception on that?
Well, I do think we should admit, and even as A.G. Daniels said in 1919, he said, if I heard a preacher standing up and saying that she held this Bible up for this period of time, I would wonder if that really happened. And so, as has been said here, there is a risk in advancing these miraculous stories above other spiritual and theological art. Advancing these miraculous stories, we actually, in some minds, undermine confidence, because people will say, well, the spiritualists, they claim to be able to float tables and beds around, and that was all happening in that era. So that these Adventists, they're just deluded. So I would think, if I were working for you now, Ted, at the center there, and people came in and they wanted to hold the Bible, I think I would say, now folks, we have this story, and it's been used for many years, that Ellen White held this Bible up in vision for half an hour. It is not well documented historically. J.N. Loughborough claims it happened. Arthur White certainly believed it happened, but we should not rely on miracles as the basic proof of Ellen White's ability to speak with prophetic authority. But here's the story, and I like to use this story to illustrate that Ellen White elevated the Bible. If you think the evidence is good for her elevating it physically, then you go that way. I think it's good for her elevating it in her teachings. and let it go at that, and say to the people, there are questions about this story. You can say, you can accept it or not accept it, but it's not the main thing that we want to emphasize.
Okay.
Why not just stop telling the story?
Because it's part of the folklore of Adventism. It's part of the legend of Adventism. It's part of the story of Adventism. And the way that Adventism or any other culture or any other religion has dealt with, has retained or dismissed the origin stories, you know, is that, you know, there's Brian Bull over there. He's just showing us his picture, and he's looked at the creation story and found the spiritual meaning of that, you know. So I don't know. I get a lot of mileage. I get a lot of storyteller mileage out of dealing with it, as I can see here. I didn't expect we would talk about the big Bible so much.
Okay, John Teal, you have a question. You want a question or a comment? You're muted. You're muted.
I have a quick comment followed by a question. When I was in 8th grade at John Nevins Andrews School in Tacoma Park, it was a short walk from the school up to the General Conference headquarters. And I recall that Arthur White spoke, and maybe I can't remember all that he did. He may have told the story of the hairnet. I don't know whether he had a Bible, the Bible or not. But I remember coming back and just feeling absolutely convinced that Sister White was divinely inspired. There was just no doubt in my mind. So he was very effective in his presentations, at least I think to the younger people. I have one other question. I didn't get turned in for the first part of this. I had some reasons for that. Anyway, Ron, looking back at your dissertation at Hopkins, it seems like Roy Branson was like an anathema. So what if he had advised you on your dissertation? You know, your dissertation stands on its by itself. I haven't kept up as faithfully as some reading Spectrum over the years, but it just seems like such a cruel thing that they did to you. Any comments?
Well, I always say that if I had realized that I was so out of step with my colleagues and had voluntarily resigned from the White Estate sometime earlier, I might have been a true hero. But some of the things that I did staying around so long, I think not quite a hero. But let me say two things about Branson. You know, Kenneth Wood grew up and thought of himself in relation to F.D. Nickel, for instance, the previous editor, but he thought of himself as a progressive person. And he thought of himself as someone who understood and appreciated and was appreciated by the academics in the church. And when Spectrum came along and questioned him and his views and so on and so forth, I think he was deeply hurt and deeply resented Roy and Spectrum and all the people that believed that Spectrum was the route to truth. In fact, I remember one time, and before I was dismissed from the White Estate, I was in Kenneth Wood's office, and he said, "You know, Ron, Mary and I were up in Pennsylvania at a hotel, and we were looking out the window at a little lake, and there were a lot of different types of birds out there, and we noticed that all the birds gathered together with their own species." And so when we see you being so friendly with Roy Branson, we begin to wonder about you. So I already knew before the dissertation came along that Kenneth Wood was very suspicious of Roy Branson. And it was just a throwaway to drop Branson's name. I don't know why I did it. I should have just been said, so what? I think Branson has the truth more often than Kenneth Wood, but I didn't. And so then Kenneth Wood and the others were very offended by that. That I was hiding my true advisors, that I was a hidden communist.
Oh, that's too bad.
Well, now let me speak also, though, to your experience as a child. I think that the studies during the 70s, during the 70s with Numbers and Walter Ray and Desmond Ford and all of these things that came along, I think many Adventists lost their way and left the church. Not so much, well, let me put it this way. I think they left the church because they felt like those who told them those stories should have known better. Those who were in the white estate knew these things all along and didn't tell us. And then suddenly we were shocked and dismayed. And so it led to a distrust of our leaders and distrust of the officials in the church. And so even though for many of us, those childhood stories helped to confirm our early faith, and then our faith matured over time, for others, when they learned that things were not exactly as they were told as children, it caused great disillusionment and a lack of trust in the church itself and in the church's leaders, and accounted in some places for people leaving the church.
Okay.
Here's a question from Lisa Hendrickson, another childhood friend of mine from Hawaii. I think you know her through the Danish connection. And her question on Facebook is, where are you sitting with the beech forest in view, Ron?
I don't recall. I took this picture probably in a couple of years ago, and this may be the path. Lisa may not have heard that this is actually a virtual background. It's a photograph I took in the beech forest in Denmark in the past. I really think this path may be the path that ran right behind the Nahum Church and my wife Gerda's childhood home where she lived, and so on. It looks very much like that path that goes right behind there. So that's not very far from where I am in Virum right now, and where I could go, and it would look very much like that, even though it's now 9 o'clock. It's it's midsummer and it's very bright outside still.
Okay. All right. Let
We
me
have
ask
about 8. I have another question for unless somebody else has.
I want to ask a quick question.
Oh,
But did you have a question from Facebook, David?
hello?
No,
Hello?
I just mentioned it.
Oh, Jeff, is that Donna? Do you have a question?
Yeah, it's Donna. Just a quick comment. Roy forgave you, Ron. I just don't know if the Wilsons ever did or will about the dissertation. You were in an incredibly difficult position, and I think that is probably best not emphasized anymore. You've done so much good work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think Peter had another question.
Who? Yeah,
Peter.
I had a quick question I wanted to ask. Ron, you mentioned your grandmother was disfellowshipped for not believing in Ellen White. Had that been a practice in North America? Is it still practice, or what are the conditions that such happens to disfellowship a person?
I doubt very much that it happens anymore. And I clearly remember in my seminary days, and we had Arthur White and we had some conservatives. I clearly remember our seminary days that we were taught that you don't disfellowship people because they don't believe in Ellen White's prophetic gift, or because they don't believe the 2,300 days, or because they don't believe the world was created in 6 literal days. But if they cause division in the church and discord in the church and so on, you can disfellowship them for being a divisive factor. But and I really don't know what was happening in the 1930s when my grandmother was disfellowship. I doubt that it happened very often. I doubt that it happened, but it happened to her. And I do know that the woman who did cause the problem in the church, she was the problem. She should have been disfellowship for backbiting. But anyway, that's
my understanding of what our position has been on that. I'd like to go to Peter. Peter?
Ron, you found, if I understood correctly, a problem with the Salamanca vision. Different presentation of the vision in 1890 and 1891. My question is, did you find any problems with the vision in connection with Loma Linda? Differences between the official vision of the White Estate, and if you found something different in your research?
You know, I haven't looked into that. There are 2 things I want to look into. And I still may. And one was, did Ellen White actually predict the San Francisco earthquake? There's some rumor that she kind of did. And the other one is about that statue up on the top of the hill there in Loma Linda. You know, we have the statue is called "This is the Very Place." And it's Ellen White in the carriage with Willie White. And then John Burton is standing beside the carriage. And John Burton is the one who alleged that Ellen White said, this is the very place that she saw in vision where our hospital should be located. And I think I looked into it a little bit, but I haven't checked it recently. And I think it would be an interesting thing to see if we actually have some contemporary documentation that Ellen White actually claimed that she had seen that very place in vision as a place where the hospital should be placed. So my question is, my point is, I don't know. But it'd be worth looking into. And you know, all of those things about Ellen White supposedly said that Hawaii was more like heaven than any other place that she'd ever seen. And other places where she said, I think sometimes she might have said something like, this is the sort of place the Lord has revealed to me that we should place our schools and hospitals. If she said that, you can easily understand how Burton over the years would translate that into Ellen White said, this is the very place the Lord showed her in vision where we should put Loma Linda. So that's the way stories grow, you know, stories grow. And but I don't know. It could be that she actually said that about the Loma Linda property.
Okay, David, do you want to, we've got, what, about 2 minutes? Did you want to say closing minutes?
Yes, I have a last question, and that is, with respect to your most recent article in Spectrum, Ron, you suggest that Ellen White's handwritten material be put on the internet, if I understand correctly, after they had been reviewed by a group of scholars. I wonder, why not just put them on the internet as they are?
What my suggestion was that scholars should go through and create these literal transcriptions. You know, my congenial conservative friend, Kevin, why can't I think of his name right now? But anyway, he and I worked. Is it Kevin Morgan? No, I don't know. Anyway.
Kevin Burton.
No, I think it is Kevin Morgan. Anyway, we have located more than 200 pages of handwritten Ellen White materials that have been published in various books, articles, and online. And we have